St. Louis, Missouri, December 30th, 1977. The night air is bitter, a freezing wind whipping off the Mississippi River and whistling through the narrow alleys of the South Side. But for the people of this neighborhood, something fundamental is missing. A sound that has been the steady, mechanical heartbeat of their lives for over 100 years. Since the 1850s, these 18 city blocks didn't just exist, they breathed. The brewery exhaled the sweet, heavy scent of malt and the sharp bite of hops, a sensory reminder that the world was functioning and that tomorrow was secure. Inside the Falstaff Brewing headquarters, the scene is now one of orchestrated silence. The bottling lines, which just years earlier could churn out 2,000 bottles per minute, sit motionless, their steel conveyors cold to the touch. For 3 generations, this was an industrial cathedral, where the rhythm of hammers and the clink of glass never stopped, running 24 hours a day through holidays, blizzards, and wars. But tonight, there is no night shift. There are no lunch pails being opened, and no laughter echoing from the break room taps. At 10 o'clock exactly, a shift supervisor named William Kohler, a man who has given 41 years to this floor, walks toward the main power panel. His hands, weathered by 4 decades of labor, do not tremble, but the weight of the moment is absolute. He reaches for the switches. One by one, the lights go out. The hum of the massive refrigeration units, the life support system of an empire, fades into a dull, final thud. When the gates finally lock, they leave behind a monument to abandonment that will rot in public view for 28 years. How does a titan that survived Prohibition, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars, a giant that was still profitable and employing 4,200 people, simply vanish without a bankruptcy headline? How does a company that once stood as the 3rd largest brewer in America lose its soul to a spreadsheet? The fall of Falstaff is not a story of a failed product. It is a haunting lesson in the merciless arithmetic of corporate scale and the devastating human cost when an empire is liquidated to harvest its organs. The most biting irony is that this century-long legacy was dismantled by Paul Kalmanovitz, a corporate raider who, according to those who worked for him, didn't even drink beer. He didn't see a community or a craft. He saw locked-up capital and expendable assets. Did your father or grandfather carry a Falstaff badge? Do you remember the scent of the brew house drifting through the St. Louis summer air, or the taste of a beer that was built on a blacksmith's oath of quality? Share your family's story in the comments below. We are keeping these industrial memories alive. I'm your host, and this is Industrial Aftermath. Now, let's begin. To understand the unmistakable reality of why the loss of Falstaff felt like such a profound betrayal, we have to go back to a world where industry was deeply personal and a company's reputation was forged in the heat of the brew house rather than the cold logic of a boardroom. In 1838, a 23-year-old German immigrant named Joseph Griesediek stepped off a riverboat and onto the muddy banks of St. Louis, Missouri. He didn't arrive with capital, land, or connections. He arrived with nothing but a weathered leather satchel. Inside that satchel was the most valuable thing he owned, a collection of handwritten brewing notes, a family legacy handed to him by his father back in Bavaria. At the time, St. Louis was a chaotic frontier, but for a brewer, it was a land of industrial ambition. The Mississippi River provided the essential transport for grain and finished barrels, and the city's deep limestone caves offered the natural refrigeration required to brew authentic German lager, a crisp, clean beer that required more patience and colder temperatures than the heavy ales common in the English tradition. Joseph didn't arrive with a plan for national dominance. He arrived with a simple, unyielding conviction. If you make good beer and treat people fairly, the business will take care of itself. By the 1850s, this conviction had taken physical form. Griesediek opened a small brick brewery on 7th Street, a modest facility defined by copper kettles and a crew of just 8 men. These weren't just employees, they were his neighbors. This was brewing as a trade, not a commodity. In a city where the sweltering summer heat could spoil a batch of beer in a matter of hours, Joseph's obsession with temperature control and fermentation time became his signature. He was a master of industrial poetry, operating with a level of grit and obsession that meant he was often there at midnight, personally stirring the kettles to ensure the batch stayed true. This era established what we now call the American Industrial Compact in the brewing world. When a batch went bad, Griesdijk didn't dock his workers' wages to protect his margins. He stood beside them on the floor to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. His workers were his partners in craft. This wasn't a corporate asset designed to be traded for a profit. It was a neighborhood fixture. By the 1870s, the operation had grown to fill a full city block, employing 30 workers, but it remained anchored to the soil of South St. Louis. Every tavern owner in the district knew the name, and every Friday the brewery paid its men in cash, on time, without fail. When Joseph Griesdijk died in 1889, his sons inherited more than just a collection of buildings and equipment. They inherited a specific hierarchy of craft that would define the company for the next 7 decades. In this model, quality was first, workers were second, and profit was a distant third. It was a philosophy that prioritized human stability and product integrity over rapid expansion, or the merciless arithmetic of scale. The sons were the kings of grit, building a monument to industrial ambition that served the people who made the product as much as the people who drank it. For these early generations, the brewery was the bedrock of the community. It provided a predictable future for the families of Hamtramck and St. Louis, proving that a company could be successful without sacrificing its soul. They believed that as long as they remained true to the notes in that Bavarian satchel and the blacksmith's oath that your name means nothing if your work falls apart, their empire would be eternal. They were living in a golden age of craftsmanship, unaware that the industry they were helping to build would one day be governed by men who viewed their industrial cathedral as nothing more than a liability and their loyalty as an expendable cost. The kettles were roaring, and the pride was at its peak, but the unmistakable reality of silence was already being written into the spreadsheets of the future. The stage was set for an empire that would conquer the region, but first, it would have to find a name that sounded as American as the dream it was selling. Now, let's look at the Shakespearean pivot that gave birth to the legend of Falstaff. By the turn of the 20th century, the Griesdijk family found themselves confronting a peculiar and unmistakable reality. Their greatest asset, their reputation, was being strangled by their own name, much like the Schaefer brothers who had arrived in New York with a single dollar, or Bernhard Stroh who arrived in Detroit with nothing but a wheelbarrow and a recipe. The Griesdijks had built an empire on the grit and obsession of the German brewing tradition. But as St. Louis evolved from a frontier river town into a dense, industrial heartland, a new kind of barrier was emerging. Americans in the broader marketplace struggled to pronounce the family name, and even more struggled to spell it. In an era where success was increasingly tied to rapid brand recognition, such obscurity was viewed as a death sentence. The family realized that to survive the coming motor age, they needed to shed their purely ethnic skin. There was a creeping ethnic suspicion entering public life, a subtle shift in the American landscape, where products tied too closely to immigrant identities were often viewed with a side glance of distrust by the native-born population. They needed a name that carried no trace of the old world's linguistic complications, but maintained the blacksmith's oath of quality. They needed an identity that felt familiar, legitimate, and unapologetically American, even if its roots stretched back to the old world in a more civilized or literary way. In 1903, the family looked away from the brewhouse ledgers and toward the pages of classical literature. They found their savior in an unexpected place, the works of William Shakespeare. They chose Sir John Falstaff, the rotund, jovial knight from the plays Henry IV and the Merry Wives of Windsor. Falstaff was a figure famous for his legendary appetite, his booming humor, and his unquenchable thirst for life. He was a character associated with the industrial poetry of the tavern, a man who lived for celebration, camaraderie, and the simple pleasures of a cold drink. To the greasedecks, he was the perfect bridge between the craft of the old world and the appetites of the new. The choice was a masterstroke of industrial ambition. The name was English, it was recognizable, and it carried exactly the right connotations for a city like St. Louis that was built on hard, physical labor. It wasn't just a label, it was a declaration of belonging. In 1903, the Falstaff Brewing Corporation was officially born, discarding its previous identity to gain American legitimacy. By adopting the knight as their mascot, they weren't just selling a liquid, they were selling a national fantasy of the working man's good time. The rebrand didn't just change the sign over the door. It rewired the company's entire ecosystem. Almost overnight, the unmistakable reality of their market position shifted. Sales began to climb as distribution moved beyond the tightly knit German wards and into the Irish districts and Polish neighborhoods of St. Louis. For a generation of workers, Falstaff stopped being viewed as an immigrant beer and became simply St. Louis beer. This transition allowed the brand to fit naturally into the city's infrastructure, supplying bars, stadiums, and dinner tables with a product that felt like it belonged to everyone. Inside the brewery's concrete palace, the change was felt in the sheer volume of production. The rhythm of hammers and the clink of glass intensified as the brand embedded itself into the city's daily routines. They marketed the beer as a reward for the grind of urban life, a drink for the men who spent 12-hour shifts in the rail yards, the warehouses, and the docks. It was the beginning of a social contract between the factory and the city, a promise that Falstaff would be there to provide the fuel for the city's moments of leisure. The beer was priced for volume, brewed for consistency, and distributed with a ruthless efficiency that ensured no alternative was closer. The greasedecks had successfully navigated the first major technology trap of the century, the trap of identity. They had built a monument to industrial ambition by choosing a name that could scale across state lines and through the inevitable generational shifts of the future. They were the kings of grit, believing they had solved the puzzle of the American market once and for all. But even as the orders flooded in and the copper kettles roared at full capacity, the merciless arithmetic of history was already preparing a new test. The 14-year winter of Prohibition was gathering on the horizon, a time when even a name as famous as Shakespeare's would not be enough to keep the boilers hot without a fight. The cathedral was at its brightest, and the jovial knight was at his loudest, but the unmistakable reality of silence was only a decade away. January 17th, 1920. At the stroke of midnight, the unmistakable reality of the Volstead Act descended upon the American landscape, and for the Falstaff Brewing Corporation, the world changed in a heartbeat. For decades, the Griesdeek family had built an empire on the industrial poetry of the brew house, but overnight, their entire business model was reclassified as a criminal enterprise. Across the nation, hundreds of breweries simply surrendered, locking their gates and allowing their copper kettles to be sold for scrap or melted down for other industries. But inside the 18 city blocks of the St. Louis plant, a different kind of grit and obsession was taking root. The leadership made a decision that many at the time considered a desperate gamble. They would survive by any means necessary. This was the beginning of the 14-year winter, a period of industrial triage where an empire built on the blacksmith's oath of quality was forced into a state of strategic humiliation. To keep the boilers hot and the pipes from freezing, Falstaff pivoted into products that had nothing to do with the Bavarian notes in Joseph Griesedeck's original leather satchel. They began producing near beer, a malt beverage containing less than 0.5% alcohol. It was a drink that was technically legal but largely tasteless, a ghostly substitute for the product that had once defined the working man's good time. For a company that prided itself on the rich, authentic character of its lager, bottling this glorified sugar water was a bitter pill to swallow. But the pivot didn't stop at near beer. The concrete palace that had once exhaled the sweet, heavy scent of malt and hops began to smell of sugar and vanilla, as the company turned to manufacturing soft drinks and even ice cream to keep the facility running and the workers employed. They sold malt syrup, ostensibly marketed for baking, though every household in South St. Louis knew it was the primary fuel for the secret industrial poetry of home brewing. It was a period of profound, grinding struggle. The company hemorrhaged money, was forced to lay off hundreds of its loyal workforce, and sold off auxiliary equipment just to pay the rising property taxes. Yet, the core infrastructure, the cathedral spires of the brewhouse smokestacks, remained standing as a landmark of defiance. They refused to let the equipment go cold, operating the plant just enough to keep the knowledge and the systems alive. For 14 years, while competitors' buildings rotted and their distribution networks dissolved into dust, Falstaff limped through the dry era as a monument to endurance. They were maintaining a skeleton crew of master brewers and mechanics who knew every valve and gear by heart, preserving the American Industrial Compact, even when there was no profit to be found. This stubborn refusal to quit meant that while other breweries were becoming historical footnotes, Falstaff remained a sleeping giant, its heart still beating faintly beneath layers of soda and ice cream. Then came the roar of 1933. When the Volstead Act was finally repealed, the unmistakable reality of the return of real beer hit the city like a tidal wave. Because Falstaff had never allowed its machines to fully stop, it didn't need a year to rebuild or retool. It was ready to roar back to life within months. While other breweries scrambled to rehire scattered workers and restart equipment that had been sitting cold and rusted for over a decade, Falstaff was one of the few positioned to restart production almost immediately. The return in 1933 was a masterclass in industrial poetry. The workers who had stayed through the darkest years making ice cream were rewarded with a family inheritance of job security that would last for the next 40 years. Within months of repeal, the plant was operating at full capacity, its new bottling lines rattling with a relentless pace once again. Prohibition had accidentally done something no marketing campaign could ever achieve. It had legitimized Falstaff as a company the people could trust. Survival itself became their marketing message. The brand wasn't just about beer anymore. It was about perseverance, resilience, and the ability to weather a national crisis and come back stronger. They had survived the winter, unaware that this victory would lead to a golden age of national expansion where they would eventually become a regional power and the third largest brewer in the nation. The kettles were hot, the night was back, and for a generation, the rhythm of hammers would signal a future that seemed as permanent as the Mississippi River itself. When the Second World War ended in 1945, a generation of young men returned home to the Midwest and beyond with an insatiable thirst for normalcy and a seat in the emerging middle class. For Falstaff, the unmistakable reality of this post-war boom was a signal to transform their regional success into a national empire. In 1950, the company's leadership made a strategic gamble that would define the next 15 years of their history. They decided to take the brand national. But while their rivals were building massive, centralized, industrial cathedrals of scale, Falstaff chose a path defined by industrial poetry and a unique philosophy of federation. Instead of spending the capital and the years required to build new breweries from scratch, a process deemed too slow and expensive, Falstaff grew by acquiring established regional players and folding them into their network. The strategy was simple in its industrial ambition. Keep the local brewmasters, keep the original recipes, and let each plant maintain its regional identity while sharing the resources and reach of a national name. This was the opposite of the cathedral of scale approach taken by Anheuser-Busch, which demanded absolute uniformity coast to coast. Falstaff believed that Americans didn't want one generic national beer. They wanted their beer made nearby, tasting the way it always had in their own neighborhoods. This grit and obsession for regional presence led to a frantic decade of growth, with the company completing 9 major acquisitions in just 12 years. The expansion began in earnest on the West Coast in 1952, when the old San Francisco Brewing Company was absorbed to become Falstaff's Pacific anchor. In 1953, they moved into the heartland by acquiring a struggling brewery in Omaha, Nebraska. But the crown jewel of this era arrived in 1954 with the acquisition of the historic Crescent City plant in New Orleans. This facility wasn't just a factory. It was a landmark of the South that allowed the Falstaff name to become as ubiquitous in the French Quarter as it was on the streets of St. Louis. For a time, this Federation bet paid off spectacularly, and by 1960, Falstaff was operating 8 major brewing facilities across the country. By 1965, the company reached its absolute high water mark, officially climbing to 3rd place in the nation, trailing only the giants Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz. The beer was sold in 40 states, and you could find the jovial night on tap in corner taverns from Baltimore to El Paso. In the places where working people gathered after exhausting shifts, Falstaff was the reward, the working man's good time that proved the American Industrial Compact was functioning at its peak. Inside these plants, the operation moved with military precision. At the height of their dominance, the St. Louis headquarters alone sprawled across 18 city blocks, its smokestacks rising like cathedral spires over the river. The company was pumping out 7 million barrels of beer every year, a staggering 1,840,000,000 bottles. This volume generated $184 million in revenue, the equivalent of roughly $1,800,000,000 in today's currency. However, beneath the roar of the bottling lines and the shimmering heat of the brew house, the merciless arithmetic of this expansion was creating a hidden vulnerability. In chasing national scale through acquisitions, Falstaff had burdened itself with significant debt. The very federation model that allowed them to keep their regional soul also left them with a fragmented, decentralized system that was increasingly difficult to coordinate. They had built a monument to industrial ambition, but they had also wedged themselves into a dangerous position. They were too big to remain a protected regional brand, yet too decentralized to survive the coming advertising wars against the centralized cathedrals of the industry. The night was at his loudest, and the windows of the concrete palace were at their brightest, but the unforgiving mathematics of corporate scale were already beginning to tighten the trap. At its absolute peak in 1965, the Falstaff Brewing Corporation was the physical manifestation of the American Industrial Compact. The St. Louis headquarters alone sprawled across 18 city blocks, a massive industrial kingdom where smokestacks rose like cathedral spires over the surrounding neighborhoods. Inside this concrete palace, the scene was one of mechanical choreography and industrial symphony. At its height, 4,200 workers nationwide moved with military precision to keep the empire breathing, running 3 shifts around the clock, 24 hours a day, every single day of the year. In that era, Falstaff wasn't viewed as an expendable corporate asset. It was essential infrastructure, a steady, reliable engine of prosperity that anchored entire communities. Inside those walls, the company was building something far more valuable than profit. They were building stability. The reward for a worker's grit and obsession was a life of predictability. In 1965, union wages at the plant averaged $4.50 per hour, a figure that was a staggering triple the federal minimum wage. This wasn't just a paycheck, it was a passport into the middle class. To have a Falstaff badge was to possess a family inheritance that provided for every necessity. It meant a home in the city, a car in the driveway bought with cash, and the ability to send your children to college, often the first generation in the family to attend. The benefits matched the wages in their generational generosity. The social contract between the factory and the city included full health care, dental coverage, and a pension plan that guaranteed 70% of a worker's salary after 30 years of service. Workers who stayed for 20 years were honored with gold watches, and those who reached the 30-year mark had their names etched onto plaques in the employee hall, a permanent record of their contribution to the cathedral. This created a culture of profound generational pride. In the neighborhoods of South St. Louis, the brewery was the center of a thriving, blue-collar aristocracy. It was a world where fathers brought in sons and uncles brought in nephews, creating family trees that grew entirely within the rhythm of the plant's shifts. You didn't just work at Falstaff, you belonged to it. Every August, this sense of belonging spilled out of the factory gates and into the city's green spaces. The annual company picnics in Forest Park became legendary, gathering 10,000 people workers and their families for a day of celebration that felt as permanent as the Mississippi River itself. The brewery gave these men and women an identity. To say, "I work at Falstaff," meant your bills were paid and your future was mapped out in decades of steady, meaningful work. The beer they produced still adhered to the old-world standards Joseph Griesdeck had brought from Bavaria, with a 30-day fermentation process that refused to be rushed by the merciless arithmetic of speed. Management still believed that craft and scale could coexist, and the workers took pride in the fact that if the beer wasn't good enough for them to drink in the break room, it wasn't good enough for the customer. In 1965, the proof of this model's success was everywhere in the laughter, echoing from the neighborhood bars where Falstaff was the house beer, and in the sound of hundreds of men streaming through the gates at shift change with their lunch pails empty. It was an economy where labor had value and loyalty was rewarded. No one standing in the shadow of those smokestacks believed the unmistakable reality of silence could ever reach them. But just 50 miles away, in the glass towers of downtown, a different kind of mathematics was taking root. A new breed of thinker was beginning to look at those 18 city blocks, not as a community engine, but as locked-up capital, and at those 4,200 workers, not as creators, but as expendable costs. The American Industrial Compact was at its peak, unaware that the unforgiving mathematics of corporate scale were already preparing to tear it apart. By the arrival of the late 1960s, the industrial cathedral of Falstaff began to feel the first tremors of a tectonic shift it could not control. The company was not failing in the traditional sense, but it was eroding slowly and steadily, like riverbank soil disappearing into the Mississippi River. The problem wasn't the beer. Internal surveys showed that the working man's good time still had a fiercely loyal audience, and blind taste tests remained positive. The problem was visibility. The battlefield of the motor age had moved from the neighborhood tavern and the delivery route to the glowing rectangle in the American living room. This was the television trap, an unmistakable reality where the rules of competition were being rewritten by mind share rather than the quality of the forge. In 1970, Falstaff's market share stood at a respectable 6.2%. But as the decade progressed, the merciless arithmetic of national advertising began to take its toll. By 1972, that share had slipped to 5.1%, and by 1974, it had plummeted to a mere 2.8%. They were witnessing a slow-motion hollowing out, where each individual percentage point lost felt manageable, even as the cumulative effect was catastrophic. Falstaff was caught in a lethal vice. It was too large to survive as a protected regional brand with its massive overhead and plants scattered across the country. But it was far too small to compete in the national advertising wars that now defined the industry. The ammunition in these wars was capital, and the scale of spending was staggering. In 1968, Anheuser-Busch spent $40 million on advertising, a sum that exceeded Falstaff's entire profit margin. By 1972, that budget had swelled to $60 million. Then came Miller, which had been purchased by the tobacco giant Philip Morris in 1970. This acquisition brought something the industry had never seen before: cigarette money. Suddenly, Miller possessed an unlimited war chest and the marketing machinery that had turned Marlboro into a global powerhouse. They flooded the screens with slogans like, "Tastes great, less filling," buying up American consciousness and squeezing regional brands into the margins. Falstaff tried to fight back, increasing its own ad spend to $12 million. But it was like throwing stones at tanks. For every dollar Falstaff spent, the giants spent 5. This is where the unforgiving mathematics of Wall Street entered the brewhouse. Here is the cruel irony. Despite the slipping market share, Falstaff was still a functioning, healthy entity. In 1974, the company cleared $20 million in profit. The machines were still running 3 shifts. The workers were still taking home their passport to the middle class, and the concrete palace was still breathing. But on Wall Street, slow growth is viewed as blood in the water. A new breed of investor, the corporate raider, had discovered that a stable, profitable company was often worth more in pieces than as a functioning whole. They looked at the 18 city blocks of prime real estate in St. Louis and saw not a community engine, but locked-up capital. In June 1975, the shark finally arrived. His name was Paul Kalmanovitz, a man who, as the workers would bitterly remember, didn't even drink beer. At 68 years old, he was not a brewer. He was a liquidator who specialized in buying businesses at bankruptcy prices and stripping them for parts. His holding company, S&P Corporation, purchased the entire Falstaff empire for a mere $18 million, a figure that seemed reasonable only if you ignored the fact that the St. Louis real estate alone was worth at least $30 million. To Kalmanovitz, the 4,200 workers and their American Industrial Compact were nothing more than a spreadsheet correction. He didn't see the grit and obsession that had sustained the company through Prohibition. He saw expendable assets. The morning after the acquisition, the mood inside the plant was like a funeral as men realized the unmistakable reality of their situation. One veteran worker put it plainly: "He didn't buy us to run a brewery. He bought us to close a brewery." The industrial cathedral was still standing, and the kettles were still hot, but the calculated crime of liquidation had already begun. The patient was stable, but the liquidator was ready to harvest the organs. In June 1975, the industrial cathedral of Falstaff Brewing met its ultimate predator. It was the arrival of the unmistakable reality that the century of craft was being handed over to a man who, as the workers would bitterly remember, didn't even drink beer. His name was Paul Kalmanovitz, and at 68 years old, he was not a brewer or a master of the forge. He was a liquidator who had mastered the merciless arithmetic of buying distressed empires to strip them for parts. His holding company, S&P Corporation, executed a takeover that analysts viewed as a clinical industrial autopsy. They purchased the entire Falstaff legacy for a pittance, $18 million. To the casual observer, it was a business transaction, but the numbers revealed a calculated crime. The St. Louis real estate alone was valued at $30 million, and the specialized equipment across their 8 facilities was worth another $20 million. By any honest accounting of the concrete palace, Kalmanovitz had acquired at least $50 million in assets for pennies on the dollar because the market had reclassified a stable, profitable company as a liability. To Kalmanovitz, the 4,200 workers and the families they supported were not the lifeblood of a community. They were a spreadsheet correction waiting to be made. He didn't see the grit and obsession that had sustained the company through the winter of Prohibition. He saw only expendable costs. His business model was simple and brutal. Buy a recognizable brand at bankruptcy prices, fire everyone who didn't directly produce revenue, and then eat the seed corn of a century of craftsmanship. The true nature of this new era was revealed on January 12, 1976, a Monday morning that would be remembered as the calculated murder of the company's future. The entire marketing department, 127 people, was summoned to a conference room at the St. Louis headquarters. These were the people who had built the campaigns that made Falstaff a household name across the Midwest, the ones who had protected the American Industrial Compact by connecting the beer to working-class identity. They believed the meeting was about restructuring. They had no idea it was an execution. The meeting lasted exactly 11 minutes. A lawyer from S&P Corporation read a cold, prepared statement informing them that every position was being eliminated, effective immediately. There were no handshakes, no expressions of gratitude for 20 years of service, only the presence of security guards standing by the doors to escort them out like criminals. When one copywriter, stunned by the finality, asked who would handle the advertising moving forward, the response from the lawyer was a chilling testament to the liquidator's logic. There won't be any advertising. The numbers that followed were staggering in their unforgiving mathematics. The advertising budget, which had stood at $12 million in 1975, was slashed by 97%, plummeting to just $400,000 in a single year. The brand that had once been ubiquitous in 13 states suddenly went silent. Kalmanovitz wasn't interested in building a future. He was harvesting the past. He was relying on decades of customer loyalty to keep the revenue flowing, while he refused to spend a single dime to maintain the brand's presence. Inside the walls of the cathedral, the mood turned from industrial poetry to a funeral march. Men stood at their stations, their hands moving through familiar motions, but their faces showed the math they were already doing. How many more paychecks before the axe falls? One veteran worker put it plainly. He didn't buy us to run a brewery. He bought us to close a brewery. The concrete palace was still standing, and the beer was still rolling out to distributors. But the soul of the company had been reclassified as a cost, and the patient was being kept alive only long enough to harvest the organs. The machines were still humming, but it was the unmistakable reality of silence that had become the true master of Falstaff. By the spring of 1976, the industrial cathedral of Falstaff entered a phase that analysts would later describe as a managed poisoning of the brand. Paul Kalmanovitz, having already executed the marketing department, turned his focus toward the very heart of the concrete palace, the brew house. He ordered a series of cost optimizations, a clinical term for the deliberate degradation of a century of craftsmanship. The merciless arithmetic of the spreadsheet now dictated the recipe. The high-quality barley malt, which had been the backbone of the Bavarian tradition since 1838, was diluted with cheaper rice and corn fillers. The industrial poetry of the brewing process was replaced by the frantic, unyielding pace of throughput. The sacred 30-day fermentation cycle, a timeline that Joseph Griesdek had insisted could never be rushed, was slashed in half to 20 days, then finally squeezed down to just 15. Quality control staff was gutted by 60%, leaving the remaining brewmasters as reluctant witnesses to their own professional execution. Karl Barra, a veteran of 31 years, would later recount the heartbreak of watching the product he loved being turned into something thinner and more watery. His reward for pushing back against this slow-motion killing was a demotion to the night shift, a calculated humiliation meant to force a master of the forge into retirement. This was the unmistakable reality of a company being run like a rental car intended to be returned wrecked. No revenue was reinvested into the aging pipes or the cooling systems. Instead, the cash was harvested to service the liquidator's other interests. The end of the American Industrial Compact arrived first on the West Coast. On January 14, 1977, 600 workers at the San Francisco plant arrived for the morning shift to find a photocopy notice taped to the chain-link gate. After 87 years, the brewery was closed with the stroke of a pen. The cathedral was dismantled in weeks. The massive copper brew kettles, each large enough to hold a car, were sold to a buyer in Mexico City for a fraction of their worth. Then came the final thud in the city that had birthed the empire. On December 17, 1977, the notice was posted in St. Louis. In a move of staggering insensitivity, the announcement arrived just 2 weeks before Christmas, revealing that the plant and the futures of 1,400 workers would be erased by the end of the month. Inside the walls, the scene was one of orchestrated chaos. Men who had given their entire adult lives to the concrete palace were seen weeping at their stations. James Schroeder, a 34-year veteran, stood motionless at his bottling line for 20 minutes, staring at a system that had once promised him a predictable future. At 10 o'clock exactly on December 30th, 1977, the night shift supervisor, William Kohler, performed the final ritual of the industrial autopsy. A man with 41 years on the floor, he walked to the main power panel and threw the switches. The rhythm of hammers and the clinking of glass that had defined 18 city blocks for over a century died in an instant. The hum of the refrigeration units, the life support of the brewery, faded into a terminal silence. The liquidation that followed was an exercise in merciless harvesting. Kalmanovitz wanted cash, not a legacy. The St. Louis kettles were sold to a buyer in China for 30 cents on the dollar. The bottling equipment was shipped to Mexico. On the sidewalks outside the plant, an auction was held for the remains of a 100-year history. Desks and filing cabinets were sold for $5 each to passers-by. The industrial cathedral was now a monument to abandonment, a hollow shell where the windows were broken by vandals and the loading docks became shelters for the displaced. The soul of Falstaff had been squeezed dry, its assets scattered across the globe, leaving only a landmark of absence where an empire once breathed fire. Today, the ground where the industrial cathedral of Falstaff once breathed fire has been transformed into a temple of chance. The River City Casino now stands as a glittering reimagining of that space, a landscape where neon lights and the artificial chime of slot machines have replaced the rhythm of hammers and the heavy scent of malt. There is a biting irony in this transition. A temple of luck now occupies the very soil where a cathedral of work once stood, where 4,200 families once earned a predictable future through productive labor. Tourists now gamble away their earnings in a space designed to monetize isolation. If you walk the perimeter of those 18 city blocks in South St. Louis, you will not find a plaque honoring the blacksmith's oath of the Grisadiec family or the 34-year veterans who wept as the lights went out in 1977. Instead, you are met with the unmistakable reality that an entire way of life was bulldozed to make room for a spreadsheet correction. The transformation is complete. We have moved from the industrial poetry of making to the clinical extraction of taking. If you search the bottom shelf of a corner liquor store today, you might still encounter the yellow label of a Falstaff six-pack, often priced for less than $5. But do not be deceived by the vintage font or the jovial knight's smile. This is a commodified ghost, a zombie brand, stripped of its context and its history. The liquid inside has no connection to the Bavarian notes carried in a leather satchel in 1838. It is a product of corporate taxidermy contract, brewed by strangers in facilities that have never known the heat of the St. Louis brewhouse, owned by private equity firms that manage names as assets rather than legacies. To the men in glass towers in New York or London, Falstaff is merely a line item in a portfolio, a way to harvest the residual nostalgia of a generation that remembers when work had a home. The fall of Falstaff serves as a haunting lesson that excellence is not a shield against the horizon. The company did not die because it failed to serve its customers or because the beer was bad. It died because its community value was reclassified as a liability. In the logic of the corporate raider, a stable, profitable company was viewed as blood in the water if it grew slower than the market demanded. Paul Kalmanovitz did not see a community or a craft when he arrived in June 1975. He saw locked-up capital that was worth more dismantled and sold for parts than allowed to function as a neighborhood anchor. This is the merciless arithmetic of modern consolidation. Falstaff was merely one casualty in a massacre that saw over 100 regional breweries erased from the map by 1990, replaced by a handful of multinational giants and algorithms designed to maximize consistency while minimizing the cost of human labor. The American Industrial Compact, the unspoken promise that loyalty and hard work would be rewarded with permanence, was shredded in favor of maximizing shareholder value by any means necessary. The tragedy of the concrete palace is a warning that what feels permanent rarely is. It proves that the things we take for granted, our local institutions, our tastes, and our very identities, can be liquidated in 11 minutes if the systems that support them are replaced. Falstaff once stood for a promise that a company could be both large and humane, but today it stands as a landmark of absence, a reminder that an empire truly dies at the moment its soul is reclassified as a cost. I'm your host, and this has been Industrial Aftermath. If you believe these stories of grit, obsession, and the silence of the forge are worth remembering, please leave a like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what your city's landmark of absence is. We are keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching.